Thank you. Thank you all for coming, tuning in to the live stream. My name is Nicolas Shannon Savard. In addition to those various things, I'm also the director of Seahorse by J.C. Pankratz, which premieres on Friday night at Maelstrom Collaborative Arts. Coming so soon. It's part of the Cleveland Humanities Festival and is made possible with the support of the Baker Nord Center for the Humanities, the Humanities in Leadership Learning Series, and Synecdoche Works Theater. So in today's director's talk, I am going to talk a little bit about how feminist performance practice, queer theory, and disability aesthetics and principles of community-engaged art making informed our approach to the design and the collaborative process for this show, and how I've led the cast and crew in bringing this story to life in a way, on stage in a way that prioritizes inclusion, collaboration, community care, and the well-being of all of the artists in the room. So, before I dive into all of that, brief introduction. Hi, I'm Nicolas Shannon. My pronouns are they, them, and theirs. I tell you this because I want you to get them right when you talk about this talk later. I am also a scholar of LGBTQ and intersectional feminist performance, history, and activism, an educator in applied and community-engaged theater facilitator, a university theater instructor, now an instructor in the art history department, which was unexpected but exciting. I am an artist in this show. I'm acting as a director, but I also have a background in solo performance. I'm a writer. I'm a theatrical intimacy choreographer, and I'm an audio producer. During the pandemic, I became an audiobook narrator. I've done quite a bit of sound design, and I am a podcast host and producer. I tell you all of this because it is the context and the background that brought me to this show. So, what is this play? Seahorse is a roughly 55-minute one-act play about a transgender man named Ruben, who is continuing his attempts to conceive a child after his husband's death. It is not nearly as depressing as it sounds, I promise. In processing his grief and also his hope, he turns his insemination endeavors into moments of self-recognition, donning different personas, and of course costumes for each try. Already a very queer play. It's got quite a bit of drag going on. Juliet, Zeus, and Saint Francis all make appearances in this show. Instead of a funerary parade, the play seeks purpose for the living, the dead, and the not yet arrived. So, a little bit about how I found Seahorse, or maybe more accurately, how Seahorse found me. So the playwright, J.C. Pankratz, won the 2021 fellowship, the Frank Mosier Fellowship for Works in Heightened Language from Synecdoche Works in 2021. Synecdoche Works is a theater company out in the Bay Area. JC is a non-binary playwright, and when they won this award, the artistic director reached out to me slightly over a year ago after hearing my podcast, Gender Euphoria, and sent me an email through my website asking if I would interview them for their website. And she also attached a very short snippet of the script. And I opened this email when I was at a conference at the KeyBank Conference Center downtown. I was in the parking garage, opening up my email, trying to figure out where I was supposed to be at this conference. And I get this email and open up the script and read this absolutely gorgeous monologue about Saint Francis and his lover secluding themselves in a cave beneath the earth in the ordinary days with cheese and bread crumbs caught in their beards, laughing, choking on their spittle over a dirty joke, joking together. And I sat in my car in a parking garage in downtown Cleveland on a snowy day in March and cried at this PDF. That is when you know that a play's got power. So I got to read the full text before I interviewed JC, and what ended up drawing me to it, these are some of the original notes that I took in my little PDF version of it. I was really, really drawn to the stage directions. In addition to the poetry that Rubin himself speaks, I was really interested in the kind of personality that came out in the playwright's just description of the action on stage, and how the audience is at once observing and witnessing Rubin, but in the room with him. I particularly like the line that appears right at the bottom of the second page of the play. It's, "We are blinking awake. We are realizing it is 5 a.m. We are remembering what today is. We are ovulating." And I really liked the way that it was kind of blending time and space and connections between bodies. At times we are in Rubin's bedroom. At times we appear to be inside Rubin's body, which feels really intensely intimate. But it also has these wonderful moments of levity where after his first insemination attempt, Rubin is just breaking down and crying, but covers his face and realizes that there was still lube on his hand. And it just completely breaks the tension of the entire moment. And you can't continue to be sad. You just have to step back and reflect on the ridiculousness of it. So I think by page 5 or so, I decided that was the next show that I was going to direct. And I told JC that as soon as we stopped the recording for the interview. I said, "You're stuck with me now." And so from my position as a postdoc in the Hills program, I've had the opportunity to kind of conceptualize this production as a sort of practice as research project. So I've written my production concept for how I want to go about directing it, in the form of sort of research questions. So I started out asking, how can my directorial approach and writing of audio description, which was how I decided to kind of bring out those stage directions. They were too poetic for nobody to hear them. Traditionally, nobody says them out loud. So how can my directorial approach and writing of audio description employ disability aesthetics to create a piece of theater in which accessibility is integral to the performance and the production design? How can I apply practices from anti-racist theater, feminist performance collectives, emergent strategy, and consent-based intimacy direction to facilitate a highly collaborative and meaningfully inclusive rehearsal process? And a third question that I've been exploring with this production is, how can this production serve to provide an opportunity for LGBTQ students to build meaningful relationships with and learn from local professional artists? In today's talk, I'm going to focus more on the first couple for the sake of time, and because I do not yet know where the students' professional relationships with the artists they have met will go. We're not done yet. These questions felt particularly urgent and necessary to me as they are directly challenging some of the theater industry norms that were a really big part of my training, but that also tend to work against collaborative relationships, equity, and inclusion. So traditionally in the theater, there's a very kind of hierarchical structure between the director and the actors. What the director says goes. The actors are there to bring their vision to life. In this production, instead, I've tried to find ways of emphasizing dialogue and creative partnerships, a bit more of democratization of the whole process. Challenging norms of competition and scarcity. There's never enough roles, there's not enough time, there aren't enough resources. You have to compete with all of the people around you for that one, especially one trans role. We wanted to approach this production from a place of collaboration and abundance. There is space for you in this production if you want to tell this story. And also, I think one of our most popular sayings that comes out of the theater, the show must go on, which occasionally is a just fine approach, but often it leads to illness, injury, just really exploitative working relationships. So we've been employing what Nicole Brewer in Anti-Racist Theater calls a human-first production process. So no matter what, we're going to take care of the people in the room. And the people in the room are more important than whatever product we put on stage. So to define some of my key terms, so I'm looking at disability aesthetics, and what I'm talking about with that is generally artistic encounters that foreground and prioritize non-normative body minds. So physically disabled folks, neurodivergent folks, MAD, CRIP, mentally ill folks, making space for that experience, and also in a way that is intentionally designed to be accessible to folks that are often pushed out of the field. And that accessibility becomes both central to both the design for the people on stage and the way that the audience experiences the work. So with that, I'm really building off of the work of Tobin Siebers, Carrie Sandal, Petra Kuppers, and the performance collective Sins Invalid. I pair that with queer aesthetics, which are rooted in LGBTQ cultural practices, which really value exchanges in energy between audience and performer far more than realist linear narratives. This show in particular is far more about kind of the journey that we go on emotionally together than it is about a plot. Anything I tell you today cannot be a spoiler because there's not really one straightforward narrative. Queer aesthetics also does a lot of work with blurring and blending boundaries of different cultural categories, of masculinity and femininity, private and public, past, present, future, and high and low art. There's a very do-it-yourself sort of aesthetic to it. So that's going to be part one. Here we go. 2. So, queer trans intimacy direction. So theatrical intimacy direction is something that I've been training in for a few years. It is a consent-based and trauma-informed performance practice and pedagogical approach to staging stories with heightened intimacy. Often we think about that as sexual intimacy, but it also deals a lot with generally the emotional landscape of a story and deeply thinking about the relationships we are representing on stage and what it is like to embody those. There's very specific attention to interpersonal, institutional, and cultural power dynamics, which I particularly bring to the forefront with a queer trans lens in this story. In that, I am particularly in conversation with theatrical intimacy education, and I've learned a lot from Joy Brooke Fairfield and Raja Benz in that. And finally, community care is not necessarily this kind of nebulous feelings sort of term. It's more based in action and relationality. It's about taking mutual responsibility for meeting access needs of everybody in the room. And there's a strong emphasis on interdependence in that we all depend on each other for this work to happen and to move forward together. I'm very much informed by Mia Mingus's thoughts on access intimacy, and Nicole Brewer's anti-racist theater and human first rehearsal rooms. So to tell you a little bit about access intimacy, because it's going to be important in coming back to this. This was introduced by disability justice activist and writer Mia Mingus, and what she describes it as, it's sort of cultivating of relationships where access needs are understood, they are anticipated by those around you, and very importantly, they are addressed in a way that the person who has a need doesn't need to justify expressing that. There's an openness and a welcome to communicating what you need, and recognizing that different folks show up to a space with different levels of need and will need different things. So Mingus contrasts this with the sort of what she calls obligatory access, which is a sort of ADA model of like, you must meet these requirements, and also a passive aggressive sort of access where it's like, okay, we'll include you, but it's kind of a burden and it's hard. In a relationship based in access intimacy, there isn't that sense of burden. There is an intentional sort of radical inclusiveness, of meaningful, intentional, thoughtful way of creating space for the whole of each person in the room. So, what I am doing with this show is surrounding the central character of Ruben with an ensemble of audio describers. So a little bit about what audio description is. Generally, it's verbal descriptions of key visual information and action necessary to understanding a performance or video, artwork, other multimedia work. Generally, it's used as an accessibility measure for blind and visually impaired audiences. In the theater, it's not particularly common. It's kind of hard to add after the fact. But how it works, I've got these photos from the Royal Shakespeare Company. It's a little bit more common in the UK than it is in the US. You'll have someone up in kind of the tech booth area or in a separate room entirely, watching the performance on a monitor and describing what is happening on stage to someone sitting in the audience who will have a headset. So if we apply a disability aesthetics lens to audio description and what we've been doing working with this show, it brought up some of these questions of what happens if the audio describer is integral to the storytelling rather than an access tool that we add afterwards. What if the audio describer is a character in and of itself, or three? And how might an identity-forward style of audio description reveal additional layers of the story and additional layers of meaning? A lot of sort of general practice and guidance around audio description is you're supposed to be objective and neutral, describe what is happening, but not add any interpretation. And my approach to this is particularly informed by Liz Thompson's work. I had the opportunity to take a workshop with them back in October, and they specifically focus on critical race theory informed audio description that really asks the describer, the writer of audio description, to bring identity to the forefront and to be aware of their own biases and how that is impacting what they are describing. And also noticing, what do we leave out? Whose bodies end up marked versus not? And they're also coming from a queer trans perspective, and for folks who regularly have to debate whether or not we exist, by folks claiming to be backed by science, we're skeptical when anybody claims to be objective. Also working in conversation with Heather Mays, is a mentor and collaborator of mine with a video performance project called Awaiting Tiresias. They're a visually impaired theater director. I got to do some audio description for that work with them. And both of us are sort of building off of Petra Kupper's work in disability theater and approaching audio description, particularly in an artistic sense, of looking at what is the meaning of this visual. What is it meant to evoke, and how do we communicate that through poetry, rather than more literal description, which might give you a sense of what is literally in front of you, but not necessarily what it's supposed to evoke and what it means. So what I did was I took the original stage directions and broke them up into 3 different parts that were intended to be spoken on stage. So both of the examples that I'll give you are from scene 1. We have Ruben puts the thermometer under his tongue. It goes off. He reads the number, carefully jots it down with a pen on a notebook sitting on the table. A tiny moment of absolute glee. It's happening. The phone rings. Ruben grabs it. He plods over to the dresser, wears boxer briefs with a nice but not outrageous pattern, picks up the plastic cup, has a screwed-on lid, like the kind you need a urine sample in, but surprise, that's not urine. Ruben examines it in the light from the lamp. So the challenge for the actors from the beginning of the process was, after I'd broken up these lines, part of their challenge was to figure out, what is your relationship to Ruben? We're going to approach this from a place of, he can absolutely hear everything you're saying. He can see you. The audience can hear and see you. We all know this. We're not going to pretend this is anywhere close to a realistic show. I think what we ended up landing on was the audio describers exist somewhere in between the Pixar Inside Out kind of embodiment of emotions, and his friends and family and different parts of himself. The description I think that I like most is, they are all in his head and they are very real. So that is our initial description. And what we ended up with is, I'll play for you. I've got 2 people describing the same scene.
A lamp comes on and bathes the room in the hazy yellow light of too early in the morning.
Ruben shifts
Very, very carefully.
to pick up a thermometer from the side table and stick it under his tongue.
10 seconds.
They are tense.
98.2.
A tiny moment of absolute glee. It's happening. The phone.
Hello? Yeah, you can wake me up? Jesus, dude. No, I think it's fine. Here, let me.
Ruben plods over to the dresser.
Nice boxers.
A nice but not outrageous pattern.
Okay, now pick up the cup.
It's plastic, like the kind you take a urine sample in.
But surprise, that's not urine. You have to look at it under the light. Hold it up by the lamp.
All right, so in playing with those relationships between the audience, the audio describers, and the character, the actors kind of jump between who they are talking to and really bring that perspective to the forefront. I think one of my favorite exchanges in the show is that Ruben plods over to the dresser and the kind of snide, nice boxers. The other audio describer comes in and says, corrects, it's a nice but not outrageous pattern. Which kind of brings out a sort of personality. They have very distinct relationships to both Ruben himself and to how we want to communicate to the audience. Both their own perspectives on what is happening on stage, and also how they want us to see him. And they kind of jump between talking directly to him, to us, and about him. I think another one of my favorite parts is taking a look at the scene that I described earlier, of going through the insemination, and the moment after where he's crying, getting lube on his face, laughing. So I will play this first and then talk a little bit more about it.
Phone tossed to the bed, cap of the cup is
Carefully
unscrewed.
dip the cup, draw the semen into the syringe.
It's up.
Get in the bed all the way and just lean back.
Under the blanket, here. A moment of mental debate.
There's no time. Tent your underwear with one hand, with the other slide the syringe in, and then
It's awkward.
it's uncomfortable for a second. Pull out, get the lube.
He has to find it in the drawer by touch, and he has to get some in his palm with just one hand.
Practice skill for sure.
Never like this. Okay, lube retrieved.
Both hands back into the underwear. Fingers first, then the syringe can go in. Push the plunger down, and then it's done. It only takes a second or two.
But it feels like forever. We can see it in his face.
Pull the syringe out. Bend your knees back. Hold them to your chest. Nothing left to do but wait for a while.
He covers his face with his hand. You have lube on your face now. You can't wipe it off with your hand.
Maybe a pillow or a corner of the sheet.
So in there, we go from literal description of what is happening on stage and the steps that Ruben is taking to one character kind of talking him through all of the steps. And it brings out this really sort of, we've got one character who's very knowledgeable and kind of holding his hand through it. She knows everything that he needs to do. We've got the other character, on the other hand, really very much in tune with Ruben's emotions and how he's feeling in that moment. And it kind of brings out this interesting tension that we get more layers of his experience that way, and also very drastically different relationships between each of the audio describer ensemble characters and Ruben himself that we wouldn't get if it were just that entire scene in silence. We get a very sort of caring relationship We get information about what is happening with him internally, as well as physical description of what is happening on stage, which definitely breaks the rules of interpretation in audio description. But it also queers it a little bit in blending those boundaries of what are these audio describers allowed to know. And then both of them can kind of have that moment alongside him of breaking the tension, and there's sort of a sweetness that comes out in it, and a comfort. So in addition to an acting challenge in finding characters within these stage directions, we also let those stage directions turned into audio description lead our design process. So we tried generally to get as close as we could to what J.C. Pankratz told us to do. So in some cases, that was easier to do than others. I think in this one where we've got Emmett Podgorski playing Zeus, playing Ruben here, in drag as Zeus. So at the beginning of his second try, the stage direction is on the floor in front of him is a magnificent length of gold cloth, copper ropes, and lengths of fig leaves, fake flowers, a pair of hemp sandals, maybe jewels too, rings, dangly earrings. So we've got, and also he begins dressing himself with great intention, piece by piece, in a toga situation, is how the actor delivers it. At first, it has a touch of fraternity party camp, but bumbles itself into refinement, especially with the flowers. So we've got kind of this messy attempt at DIY. We are making a Zeus costume with what is in the room. In a bedroom, we were able to recreate pretty realistically. Slightly later in that scene, the direction initially was Ruben produces a golden chalice. He gets the cup of sperm, unscrews the top, and drops the entire vessel in. He swishes it around like a fine wine. We can hear the plastic container swirling against the metal. Maybe he does a little tune with it. It makes him happy for a moment. As it turns out, it's kind of hard to find a golden chalice in Cleveland in 2023. We could have recreated one and gone with the literal stage direction, but in the party section at Walmart, I found this bedazzled pink princess chalice. So we ended up going with sort of the queer version of fraternity party camp, just really playing up the ridiculousness of it all, which meant that we had to go back and edit some of the wording in our initial audio description. It is now a bedazzled chalice. That is just really fun to say and fun poetry for the actor. And sometimes we were given literally impossible stage directions. In Ruben's fourth try, he's holding a just mass of fabric. It tumbles into a lifeless pool, and in one enormous exhale, it expands into the endless dome of a parachute, rippling in the wind. Maelstrom Collaborative Arts is a relatively small, like, black box theater, studio, gallery, art space. We can fit about 50 people in there. Actual parachute was not going to happen. So we kind of approached that from a place of, okay, what's the closest we can get in here to give the sense that this is what is happening. In the right-hand corner, you can see me and the lead designer, Cassie Harner. We've got a just giant cobbled together mass of different fabrics attached to the overhead crossbar by fishing line so that it can look like it is raising up on its own. And then on the left, you've got the actors in rehearsal making it fly through a storm. Another kind of impossible stage direction that we had is we all sit with Reuben at the bottom of the ocean. He's naked. It feels rather lonely and a little scary. A sea creature, the titular seahorse, a bright, curvy little seahorse, floats down to keep him company, glistening in the deep. So there, Cassie Harner, who I met through their drag persona, Dusty Bucket, did a narrative drag Alice in Wonderland adaptation this summer at the Borderlight Festival, which we were both performing in, all in black light. So when I was thinking about how do we make the ocean happen on stage with a glowing seahorse, I immediately thought of their design for that, and brought them on board. Because if anybody can figure out how to turn a room into the bottom of the sea and also a parachute, these are also back-to-back scenes. Hire yourself a drag artist. They work quick. They get to the essence fast. So we've got a cute glow-in-the-dark seahorse under black light. So the other side of this is thinking about how can tools from consent-based intimacy direction help facilitate a collaborative and meaningfully inclusive rehearsal process. Because just the aesthetic alone doesn't necessarily lead to a queer or trans or disability affirming space. That has to be embedded into the process itself. So now I'm going to switch gears a little bit and talk a little bit about the tools that we used to build a space in which we could use these aesthetics on stage and to build those relationships. So one of the main tools that I've been using throughout this comes from, or I've developed in conversation with, theatrical intimacy direction and also community engaged theater. Both of them are thinking really actively about relationships and power. So we've been thinking a lot about risk, boundary setting, and how we offer support to each other. So to clarify how I'm thinking about those things, risk is potential for harm or danger. It's conditional, it's contextual, it's tied to power and culture. There's always multiple kinds of risk surrounding us all the time. And that's going to vary significantly depending on identities that we hold and our relationships to the other people in the space. Boundaries, or boundary setting, is an action, not necessarily something that just exists within you. They're healthy limits that, in this case, an actor puts in place to manage the risk to themselves or to their relationships. Support comes in as a strategy or a tool that can decrease potential for harm, a sort of harm reduction model of what can we do to lower the overall level of risk someone is facing in a space. So if we think of risk as a spectrum, we're also thinking about where different choices fall, and is that working within our boundaries? Is this a place where a boundary needs to be set? So the greater risk there is, I found the greater need for support. I've also found in my work with students and throughout this process that when an actor is taking on a challenge artistically that involves a high level of risk in one area, supports in other areas around that tend to help them remain within their boundaries and continue engaging in that work. So there's a lot of different kinds of risk operating all at the same time. I think about them individually. That's thinking about how could this choice impact me? And I say specifically this choice because we make throughout a theater production thousands and thousands of artistic choices. And we can look at all of them kind of individually. So there's physical risk and emotional risk. So physical would be might this choice impact my body, expose me to harsh environmental elements, risk of illness. Emotional risk is thinking about how is this likely to impact me emotionally, or how vulnerable does it require me to be? Personal risk, we're thinking about how likely is this choice to ask me to challenge or compromise my own values or beliefs? And creative risk, which is usually the one that we mean in artistic contexts when we say take big risks. That's a thing that I feel like we need to clarify a lot of the time, because when those definitions get muddy, things get messy. So creative risks are thinking about how might this choice challenge my artistic skills? How might it challenge my thinking or my approach to working? And also, what are the chances that I'm going to fail? On the other hand, there's interpersonal risks, really thinking about how someone's relationships might be impacted by a choice. So there's social risks. How might this impact my relationships or my standing with my peers, with my friends? It's cultural risks. How might this impact my standing with my family, my community, my faith? There's professional risks. My standing with my colleagues, my supervisor, my industry. And I will say in the theater, setting boundaries tends to put you at very high risk of damaging your standing within the industry. You become labeled hard to work with, difficult, unwilling to collaborate. And so how I have kind of paired this with access intimacy is thinking about risk and support and boundaries in conversation with those. And I've approached my planning of this rehearsal process and this artistic process with the question of what conditions would make my rehearsal room a place where a trans actor playing Ruben can take the creative risks necessary to tell this story with honesty and with complexity. Acknowledging that telling this story also takes a hell of a lot of emotional risk. There's a lot of social risk involved. Publicly being visible as a trans person in Ohio in 2023. That also has some interplay with cultural risk, visibility. And so I was taking access intimacy into account and all of these different types of risk as I was designing the rehearsal process and assembling who was going to be in the room. So part of that tied into my other goal of building more collaborative relationships. The audition process in theater is traditionally an actor comes into a room before sometimes one director and a stage manager, sometimes a whole panel of directors, casting for a variety of shows, and they're asked to deliver either a 90-second monologue. You get your introduction, you say your name, who you're playing, 90 seconds to prove yourself. A very straight-faced director makes notes, says thank you, and you leave. Or there's a cold read, which is basically you are handed the script on that day, and you try to make a character of it. I didn't think that was a particularly great way of starting a collaborative relationship. I can think of no other scenario where you are asked to prove to a potential employer who you are and what you can do within 90 seconds. So instead, I approached auditions as more of a conversation, an invitation into a collaborative relationship, if they still wanted to be part of it. at the end of the conversation, kind of putting myself as much on the spot as a director as they are, and kind of mutually making that decision together of, do we want to work together on this over the next couple of months? So I asked about what brought you here today and what drew you to this story specifically. As an artist, what are you most interested in exploring in this production? And if I can't cast you on stage, are you interested in being involved in another capacity? And what other aspects of the production might you want to lend your expertise or efforts to? So kind of really making that space of abundance, that there is enough space for you here. If you want to be a part of this, I can find a way. And through those conversations, I'm also kind of assessing, like, what is your relationship to this story? And who am I bringing into this process surrounding the actor playing Ruben? Am I putting him in a situation where he's going to have to educate everybody else in the room about what it's like to be trans, about what trans means, about what a pronoun is? So in this conversation, I'm kind of also assessing, like, what knowledge are you bringing to this? Do you already have a relationship with the queer community here? But also kind of exploring what interests folks artistically has really inspired the ways that I broke up the lines for the audio description, in allowing people to play into what they were most interested in that. The third question was how I got Dusty Bucket to come be a designer on the show. They'd wanted to be an actor, but are off performing at International Drag Fest in Austin the weekend of the show. Another one of the actors is also a teaching artist who does sound design, so he's teaching one of the students a bit about that. So it was a much more holistic way of approaching the creative process, I've found. Second portion of assembling the team, one challenging or kind of traditional rehearsal model, was to have an open rehearsal style audition. And I gave the actors a bit of the script to work with, and I coached them through it so they could get a sense of who I am as a director, and how I work. And then I gave them a creative challenge. I gave them that section at the bottom of the sea, falling from the parachute, a box full of props, and said, you have 15 minutes. You can use anything in the room, stage this. I'll come back then. And this is what I came back to up here. This is Justin Miller and Emmett Podgorski with my bed sheets hanging from the projector, making shadow puppets with their phone lights. So kind of getting a sense of what it's like to collaborate with the other people in the room and whether you want to work with them. And also it's a bit longer and more engaged of a way to allow people to really work together and display a variety of different skills they might bring to the table beyond just reading the words on the page. So in the rehearsal room itself, once this got started, I was really intentional about thinking about how do we make this a explicitly queer affirming, disability and neurodivergent supportive space. And part of that started from, where do we host this? And that is where I came across a few different conflicting access needs. The spaces that I had access to in the building that were ADA accessible were places like this library where you have to get in by showing an ID, which can put a trans person in an at best uncomfortable situation if they've not legally changed their name, of someone questioning them as to, like, is this really you? It essentially outs them every time they have to present identification. At worst, violence. So I didn't want to put anybody in that kind of situation. The building that I work in is not ADA accessible, but they were unlikely to have to interact with anybody other than me and the other folks showing up specifically to our space if we are working on like a Saturday afternoon. So once we've arrived at the space, we start with a daily check-in to let us be human together before we have to be artists. Ask about where are you coming from? How are you doing today? Tell us about a moment of queer joy you have had lately. We don't get enough chance to express that. We also ask about access needs right from the beginning of the rehearsal. And things that brought out is really like offering each other tools of what can we do together to make this process just easier to navigate. Part of that was putting in a reminder 2 hours before on the Google Calendar invite for each rehearsal, so we know who needs to be where, at what time. There's parking directions because parking is a nightmare on campus and we're working in all sorts of different spaces. And 2 hours gives enough time for Justin, who is driving from Akron, to get here. It gives enough time for me to remember to eat dinner before rehearsal, for everybody else in the room to kind of mentally transition from whatever it is they're doing and prepare to get to where they need to be. There were a lot of things that we implemented of like normalizing asking for breaks, developing language around how are we going to set boundaries, and normalizing actually listening to those. Which one of the tools we used for that was one that I've borrowed from Theatrical Intimacy Education. It's called a button, and it's just a little pause button that you tap twice. It can exist anywhere on your body or on this podium. And whenever anybody taps it, anyone in the room, that's a signal that a boundary needs to be set. You need clarification, you have a question, you need a break, a breath. You need some other form of support. And how it works is you double tap, everybody in the room takes a pause. Together we take a breath and ask, what do you need? That simple. So what happens when we do that, I've been ignoring my cards. So I have found that when you communicate boundaries and explicitly model ways of setting them, as a director, I found I get told no a lot more often than I have in the past. As I am trying to stage things and coming up with ideas, rather than stepping up on the dresser to create some height for that parachute, or up on the milk crates, the actor actually feels comfortable saying, you know, I'm scared of heights, and could we either have me less than a foot above the ground or find some other solution? As a director, it's kind of my responsibility to say yes and make a different choice. What happens when you do that is that the actor isn't just uncomfortably half committed going along to please me and fulfill my vision. They're making much stronger choices because they can feel confident in them. And they can be fully engaged. It's allowed us to work together a lot more effectively and communicate when there is confusion, when we're not quite sure what is going on, when something needs to change. It happens a whole lot earlier in the process than waiting for me to figure it out and just do it. And also I found that the actors have had a lot more language to apply those ideas about interpersonal and emotional risk to the characters that they're playing. and think more deeply about their circumstances and situation and have a much more deep emotional connection with that character and understanding of them. So what I've taken away from all of this is collaborative, experimental, community-engaged art making built on interdependence is hard. It is messy. It's a lot of work. It takes active reprioritization of people over the product that we create together, which is not necessarily something that's been modeled for me. It's taken a lot of reflection on my own priorities as a director and my values. Stopping and breathing to check in. Is what I'm doing aligned with that? It's taken a lot of letting go of unofficial rules and expectations and practices that I've inherited from the industry and from my training. A lot of active work of internally and among the cast to hold one another accountable, not to fall back on those familiar patterns that don't actually serve the work that we're trying to do together. Despite those challenges, or maybe because of them, I believe that disability aesthetics, a queer trans eye to intimacy direction can offer us models to create art that is radically inclusive, that is responsive to the people in the room exactly as they are, that is equitable, meaningfully collaborative, and that embraces bodily and cognitive difference as a source of artistic inspiration rather than some deficit to overcome. I believe these practices, these shifts in perspective, offer us a path to radically transforming professional relationships between actors, directors, designers, toward a more ethical, equitable, and ultimately deeper, more complex way of creating performance together. Thank you. And Seahorse.
I hate to be that person that has a question and a comment, but as somebody that comes out of the operatic performance world, this seems so revolutionary, this idea of a community of care, and it's fantastic. Just the idea that there's not the omnipotent director, the 90-second 90-second audition, and yeah, it's amazing. It's really lovely to see. And yeah, my question is that coming out of the music world, music has that kind of liminal space as well, where it's either heard by the characters or not heard by the characters, heard by the audience, or supposedly not, just to be there as an emotional lift. How does this work kind of across theatrical forms, this idea? Does that make sense, what I'm asking?
That does make sense. I'm not sure I know the answer to that in a musical context.
It's just in a general.
I could see it working. I could see musical theater and opera being a really rich way of exploring this sort of aesthetic. I think a lot of what I've been doing, not necessarily as a director, but in writing the audio description and in breaking that up, I kind of thought of it a little bit like parts of a harmony, and sort of conducting, how are we telling this story, who brings in what part. So I think I don't know yet of other pieces to point to that are doing this, but now I'm interested to go find them. Thank you for your question.
Yeah, it reminds me of harmony. It's so great. Yeah, thank you.
Hi, Nicolas.
Hi.
That was a great talk. So my question is about the confidence you feel in going from the 90-second audition to a more open-ended see what you come up with. I'll leave the room, come back, kind of audition. It makes me think about like phenomenology is methodology that a lot of feminists sort of consider. So how did you decide to do that, and why did, or how, and how did you know it could work?
Let's see. How did I know it could work? I'm going to undermine my confidence a little bit and say I did not know that it could work. I was sending a shot in the dark and a lot of hope. But how I came up with it was thinking a little bit about, I think it took a lot more reflection beforehand of what I was looking for in actors and also in collaborators. I think I bring a lot of my theater for social change and theater in community background from that. I think that's taught me a lot about being really open to people bringing multiple different forms of themselves, essentially, into the space. This process specifically, I am indebted to Dr. Elizabeth Wellman, who we were at Ohio State at the same time and worked on theater for social change projects together. And in the planning process, I was also in conversation with Sarah Armstrong at University of Michigan's Center for Research in Teaching and Learning Players program. Mostly I was just going around to different directors who I really admired. And I was like, people seem to be really engaged when you're working with them and just happy to be in the room together. How do you go about finding collaborators, and what are you looking for? And something Sarah told me that really stuck with me throughout this process was prioritizing the ethos that people are bringing to the space, and kind of their reason for engaging in the work over specific training. So in short, I cared a lot more about why you wanted to be involved in this project than your resume, how much Shakespeare you've done. It was not the kind of the specific skill that I was looking for here. So I was trying to kind of imagine ways that might get about allowing people to kind of showcase what it is they're bringing to the table.